couple pages forward is Mark 16, 1 through 8. That's page 147. Page 47 in your pew Bibles. Now, you'll notice when you look at this, and this is why I always like you to crack open the Bibles and look at it. What's new about most modern translations is they have notes. Even the briefest of notes beat none. And they have one called the shorter ending of Mark and the longer ending of Mark, both of which are newer than the first part. There's also another part that didn't get included, and it's part of the Washington Codex, which was bought by Mr. Freer of the Freer Art Museum at the Smithsonian. And it's called the Freer Logion. And what's different about this is that somebody felt a need to tack something on to either complement the other Gospels or to just finish what Mark did. Because when Mark comes to a conclusion here, it's going to come to a screeching halt. This is not your normal Easter Sunday scripture. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of James and Salome brought spices so that they might go and anoint him. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. They had been saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance to the tomb?" When they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled back. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe, sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. But he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. Look, there is the place where they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Is there a happy ending anywhere?
Happy ending.
There is a happy ending, but it's not written about. The happy ending is Jesus isn't there. But unlike a lot of the rest of the Gospels, that's where it stops. Unless you go on to the other parts. And it's kind of interesting, because there's one that has lots of long words that just follows the last half of 8 before 9. And then at 9, there's another longer ending that comes in. And in that one, Jesus comes back and kind of disses on all the disciples and basically going, "Still don't get it, do you?" And then in the Freer Logion, they go, "Wait a minute, it's not our fault. The devil got in the road." I didn't know Flip Wilson was alive in New Testament times. The devil made me do it. No. So, at any rate, then Jesus says, well, whole point of this is the power of Satan is broken. Evil is cracked now, and life will triumph, which is a good point. But I do like how this just ends. Mark is the oldest, shortest, simplest, and most direct gospel, and this ending fits the rest of the gospel just fine. And Jesus did this, and Jesus did this, and Jesus did this, and Jesus got arrested, and Jesus got crucified, and Jesus isn't in the tomb anymore. And the book ends. Now, Paul goes on, and part of why I wanted to do the one from 1 Corinthians is it's one of the very few places, not in the Gospels, where it talks about Jesus after the resurrection. And Paul lists a whole bunch of people who saw the risen Jesus. And he talks about himself at the end as kind of an exception. He talks about the disciples. He talks about James. And James needs to be explained. from our readings of the secular histories. This is not James the disciple. This is not James the Less. This is James, who is recorded in Jewish records as the brother of Jesus, who was a very devout Jew and lived in the temple and was killed sometime before AD 70 in the temple. And he was the leader of the early church in Jerusalem. Now that's interesting because during Jesus' ministry, his brothers and sisters and mother, when he went from the wedding feast at Cana of Galilee over to Capernaum and started teaching, his mother and his brothers and sisters came because his mother decided he was nuts and he should stop doing this and he should come home. And his brother sided with the mom. There is a legend that says Jesus, after the resurrection, comes to his brother and says, "Do you get it now? Do you understand?" And James goes, "Yeah." And it's not that he was somehow a non-believer who got the job because he was part of the Jesus family, although that may have been important. It's because outside the record of the gospel stories, James changed. We know he was an extremely devout Jew in Jerusalem, in the temple. We know that he was killed. That's all from separate sources. Just like we also hear in this gospel story, somebody else singled out. Now, James is not one of the apostles, so go tell James. And James saw him, and the apostles saw him. And by the way, and notice, and 500 other people saw him, most of whom are still alive. So, if you don't believe me, go check with the people who saw him. Somebody else is singled out. He's singled out in the Gospel of Mark. Go tell the disciples and Peter. Why did we single out Peter? Well, Peter is the only person who was loyal enough to stay with him and go to the high priest's courtyard, but he's also the one who, when he got caught there, denied him 3 times. And yet there's no mention of blame, like the long ending where Jesus lets the disciples have it and they kind of sass him back. There is just, go tell Peter to meet me in Galilee along with the other disciples. And you'll see him just as he told you he would. These people are picked out by name. Why? Well, partially because their stories underscore big reasons of why we need to be in a better relationship with God. And also because they are dramatic ways of showing how people can change. I called this sermon, "Let Him Call Your Name." There is a more famous one, which is the alternative gospel from John for today, which is the story of Mary Magdalene. And you know there's been this whole big discussion of whether she's Mrs. Jesus or not. Does it matter? Almost every good Jewish boy was married by the time he was 20. Nobody ever recorded the names of the wives. However, if she was his wife, how come it's never mentioned? Odd silence there. Mary is at the tomb after the rest of the women leave. They have seen the angel, but Mary's not convinced. And she sees through her tears somebody she thinks is the gardener and says, "Oh, sir, tell me where you've laid him and I will go get him and bury him right." And Jesus just does one thing. He says her name, Mary. And from the tone of his voice, she knew it was him. And she turned to him and said, "Master, Rabboni, teacher," and knew he was alive. It is important to know that these people's stories are affected because they knew Jesus and they still knew him at the end. Now, we could get sidetracked by asking, how did he get raised? And by the way, he's not self-rising flour. I used to say in the land of King Arthur's self-rising flour down in the southeast United States that Jesus is not a self-rising biscuit. He's raised by a power greater than what's in just him. By his relationship with God, he is raised back to life. It's not something that's inherent. Jesus is not a superhero. Jesus does not have a cape, and he does not wear lead underwear. He is instead a person. He's a person who for many of us fully embodies and shows what God would do as a person. But it's also true that he's a real human being. How do we explain somebody who, as C.S. Lewis says, takes death and runs it backwards? How do we explain somebody who takes the most heinous and ignominious death and swallows the whole thing up and comes back with life? Well, we know this. They believed they saw him. They believed they touched him. They believed that they ate a meal with him more than once. Part of the reason it's important to know that they ate a meal with him is to prove that, unlike what's going on in almost every Roman funeral cult of the time, Jesus is not just a spirit, not just a survivor, a survival. He's a living presence. Because, let me tell you, if you have a funeral chapel and every guild of masons and fishermen and everybody else had a funeral chapel, and wealthy families had a funeral chapel, and not wealthy families shared one, and you would go in once a year, once a quarter, whenever your schedule was, and you would have a big meal. And, by the fourth glass of wine, you're probably going to see Uncle Fred at the end of the table. Because you really want to see Uncle Fred. It's kind of like when I talk to people who are widowed or who lose a child. You have so many memories built up of things being a certain way that widowed people turn to me and say, I keep seeing them. Am I nuts? No, you're not. You've got 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years of experience of seeing this person day by day. Is it any wonder that if they're gone, you still see them out of the corner of your eye? That's what your brain expects. And that's what your heart wants. There's also this. We could simply say this is a spring festival. This is the triumph of light triumphing over dark, of warmth triumphing over cold, of life springing forth again. A little less obvious in the semi-tropics, but still true. And just because it is a spring festival doesn't mean it wasn't the right time for God to do this. And it doesn't mean that there aren't plenty of things to learn from other faiths about how this renewal works. But what we make a claim to is this, that Jesus is uniquely the one who comes back from death, the first one, and that the rest of us will be able to follow him into that new life to come. And that rather than being lost and alone and hurt and depressed, you can be alive. You can be really alive. And I don't mean you can have a temporary good feeling because it was a really nice sermon, Pastor, thank you very much, and then we go have the hamburger and we forget about it. What you can be is really alive, aware, conscious, helpful, and wanting to be helped, so that you can engage with other people, and you can engage with God, and you can engage with the world in a new kind of way, because you've discovered that separation, death, and desertion are not the end, but instead a beginning. And that a loving God will not let us go, and sent Jesus into the world not to give us judgment, but to help us out. I loved one I found on Facebook. I have to watch quoting Facebook from time to time. I used to go to a church where I swore she was the preacher of NPR, and I don't want to become the Facebook padre. But it said, "Oh, you want to judge me? Is Jesus hiring?" Instead, the toughest thing in the world is to understand that you're loved beyond measure. Now, those of us that have been married a long time know that, yeah, we're loved very deeply, and she'll probably never get rid of me, but not beyond measure. There are days she just really doesn't want to see my face. And I probably deserve it. And there are days when I don't want to talk to her either. And I'm sure there are days when parents and children feel the same way. I would do really well if my parents would just not talk to me for at least 2 days. I'd be fine. Well, the rub is that God doesn't believe that. God believes that love is active and caring and a bit nosy, and wants to know, are you doing well? And if you're not doing well, why not? I am a loving God. I really want what's best for you. Why are you sitting in a corner all dejected when you don't have to? Wake up. Jesus is alive. He's loose in the world. Let him call your name. Let him show you a new way of life, not just salvation from bad consequences, or not just bodily renovation or rejuvenation, but instead a new way to really live and be alive when he calls your name. Our hymn is 250 in the Brown Book, Jesus Christ is Risen Today.